Thank you so much to everyone who is attending our 5th session of the Day of Dialogue. We have more to talk about than we have time in the day, of course. So this session is actually about the gangs on Long Island. Just a little introduction, I'm Callie Nguyen, and I am the Graduate Assistant for On-Campus Events and Civic Literacy at the Center for Civic Engagement. Our mission at the center is to encourage students to take an active role in their communities and to foster broader national and international dialogue. We do that by putting on events like these and others, but also through encouraging students to work with local community organizations in Nassau County. If you yourself are an undergraduate student with whom these ideas resonate, please consider applying to one of our fellowship positions, which we will have opening next semester. Just to think of a few folks really quickly. We are grateful to the Provost Office and University Relations for their continued support. And we are indebted to the Executive Director of the Hofstra Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins, for all of the work she has invested in today's events. We are also thankful to the Center's Director, Phil Dalton. And I would also like to recognize the Center for Civic Engagement's fellows who have been instrumental in these events. Finally, I'll ask you to note a link I'm about to post to the chat. This link will take you to the other events we have scheduled for today. So after the session is over, please take a look at that and join us for some more dialogue. Now I will hand this off to today's moderator and Vice Dean of the Herbert School of Communications, Mario Murillo, Professor.
Thank you, Kali. I just want to make sure I'm not on mute after doing this for a million times. But thank you, Kali, and greetings, everybody. It's so great to have all of you here today. I would be so much better if we were physically together in the same room to meet face to face, but I think we're all getting used to this. And given that this is the first Zoom-based CCE's Day of Dialogue, tremendous hat, and my hat goes off to all the people involved in Day of Dialogue today. The focus of today's all-day events is the state of the US, the state of the United States, our issues and elections in 2020. And as most of us know, it's pretty, to be kind, scary out there right now on so many different levels. So it's an important day. The Center for Civic Engagement, as Kali pointed out, when Cornel West spoke here during the last election cycle in 2000, I think it was in 2012 or 16, I can't remember which election he spoke. Time becomes a blur after a while. He said, Center for Civic Engagement, it's really the Center for Community Organizing and community participation and community activism. And in reality, that's what the idea is, to get the students to get outside of the university and really get engaged. And I feel privileged and honored to be a part of it. I used to be the director of the CCE, and I salute Philip Dalton, the current executive director of the CCE. And also a shout out to Kathleen Collins, who's done tremendous work in bringing so many great people, voices to the campus almost on a daily basis. So it's very good. Thank you, Kali, as well, graduate assistant for the CCE, and all the fellows that are involved in it. My name is Mario Murillo, as Kali pointed out. I'm a professor of communication here, as well as in Latin American Studies. Currently serve as the Vice Dean and a member of the advisory board of the CCE. Today's session that we're doing now, these next 90, 80 minutes or so, we called it The Gangs of Long Island, Myth-Making, Policy-Making, and the Origins of MS-13. And I believe that in many ways, the session's extremely timely, given the current White House occupants' constant refrain on the campaign trail about the violent criminality in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and his consistent use of MS-13 as we can call them the poster children of both weak policies on crime as well as on immigration. Unfortunately, that has been the tag we've been hearing again and again. This is not even to mention his ongoing very loud dog whistling related to his prediction of the demise of the suburbs as we know it, again, because of the violence that's carried out by groups like MS-13 in places like right here on Long Island. So I think it's very timely that we're doing this today. We're lucky to have two very special guests who I consider friends and people that I've admired for a long time. So I'm glad that they've been able to join us today, who know and understand from very unique perspectives the history of MS-13, the organization, which takes its name from the phrase Mara Salvatrucha. As Kali said, there's tons of things to unpack. Clearly in this 80-minute session, we're not going to be able to tell the entire story and understand it fully. But one of our goals here is to go deeper about this situation, about the MS-13, beyond the sensationalist news coverage of the MS-13 that we see again and again, and of course the harsh rhetoric coming from the White House about this gang. Lesser known to a large number of people in the media, less discussed, is how flawed US policies in Central America, but also in other parts of the world, and right here at home, in many ways help foster and sustain MS-13 as an organization. We rarely hear in these conversations about MS-13, whether it's in policymaking circles or on network television, et cetera. We rarely hear how policymakers in the US and the problematic and exploitative economic systems in which these policies are being developed, both in countries like El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, but also right here in the United States, how these policies lead to the kind of situation we face today. And that's our hope, that we can at least begin to shed some light on that with our two guests. I also hope that we'll be able to spend some time, given that we are on Long Island. I'm here in my office at the Herbert School of Communication, right across the street, basically from Uniondale High School, where Serge is from, where he is the dean of students there, but also where a lot of these issues are impacting our communities very closely. So with that in mind, let me just introduce our guests. The way we're going to do this, I think, is we'll hear from our two panelists, 10 to 12 minutes. I know both of them could spend an hour each, at least, to talk about these issues, but we'll start with like a 10 to 12-minute introduction from both our panelists. I might ask a couple of questions, kind of moderator privilege, but clearly opening it up to conversation and questions from all of you who are participating in this session. So again, both people that are joining us, Stephen Dudley and Sergio Argueta, I consider friends and I've admired for a long time. Stephen Dudley is an investigative journalist and co-founder of an important organization. If you haven't checked out their website or looked into some of the work they do, it's called Incite Crime, a think tank that's devoted to investigating organized crime and corruption in the Americas. And when we say corruption in the Americas, let's not say we're only looking at South America, Mexico, Central America, because corruption in the Americas is a continental thing and very often emanates with impunity from North America, and particularly the United States of America. So Incite Crime recognizes that, and some of the work that I do is very important in that regard. He's the author of a just published book, which I'm about 2/3 of the way through. He was going to call me out before, but I'm definitely well deep into it. MS-13, I don't know if you can see it. MS-13, The Making of America's Most Notorious Gang. Again, it tells a story from personal, but also a lot of in-depth investigation that Steve does. He's a longtime journalist, so he's been doing this for a long time. He's written for the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, Columbia Journalism Review, among many other publications, and he reported for a long time from South America for National Public Radio, for NPR. I remember used to listening to him all the time on NPR. I did want to point out about his first book, which came out, I can't remember when it came out. Steve, you can tell us. It was called Walking Ghosts, Murder and Guerrilla Politics in Colombia. And as somebody who studied Colombia extensively over my journalistic and academic career, this book was a valuable contribution to the ongoing study of the political genocide that was carried out by right-wing forces, very similar to El Salvador, if not worse, closely allied with the US-backed military in that country in the 1980s and 90s, leading to mass murder, in this case, the liquidation of a political party, the Patriotic Union, in the 1980s and 90s. So if you haven't read that book, check it out, an important contribution to that understanding of that context. And I'd also like to out him just for a second, and I hope he doesn't mind, because he comes into this with a passion for the defense of human rights for people, especially marginalized people. I met, and it's hard to say as I was thinking about this, I met Steve, and so we already began to think that we can think back a quarter century. It's kind of scary. I never thought I'd be at that point. But I met him about a quarter century ago when he was working as a volunteer activist on the ground in Colombia with Peace Brigades International, basically putting his life out there as a human rights accompaniment person in some of the most horrific conflict zones in the country. So again, and that's in that tradition, he's brought to his journalistic work to shine light on those issues. So Steve, I hope you don't mind me pointing that out, but I think that's important for people to know where you're coming from. And Sergio, on the other hand, another person who I've known for a long time, one of the most influential community activists on Long Island. He's the founder and board president of an organization many of you are probably familiar with, Strong Youth Inc., right here across the street practically. If you're wondering what STRONG stands for, you know what STRONG is, Struggling to Reunite Our New Generation, which tells you a lot about the goals and objectives of the organization. It's one of the leading gang prevention and intervention agencies in the northeastern United States. Sergio has done frontline work on these issues for many years. He's served as the gang specialist for the Nassau County Youth Board. He's currently one of the leading experts in the region on gangs and youth violence. He served as the director of the baccalaureate social work program at Adelphi University for 3 years, has served as an adjunct criminal justice professor at Nassau Community College, and is currently an adjunct professor in the School of Social Work at Adelphi, as well as Millersville University in Pennsylvania. And since 2014, he's been working at Uniondale High School, again, right here in the neighborhood, in several capacities. He's currently the Dean of Students at UHS. And he's involved in a number of community organizing initiatives, many of which I'm familiar with, and probably a lot that I'm not familiar with, which advocates for equity within some of the most marginalized communities in Nassau County. And I remember when he was a student here on campus, it was pretty apparent back then that his leadership, his vision, his passion was going to lead to a lot of change. And so to that, I pay tribute to you, Sergio, and thank you for joining us. So we'll start with Stephen, and then we'll take it from there. We'll open it up to questions.
I guess that means I'm on, right? Right,
That's
Marco?
it. That's
okay.
right.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. You know, in addition to being a friend, Mario is one of my mentors. So, he got me my start in a lot of things that I continue to do, including radio. So, this is a real honor to be here with Mario. I appreciate him, helping set this up, and also Hofstra University for allowing me to speak here, and obviously Sergio, who I look forward to hearing from. He and I have been on a panel already, so we're old hands at this, and don't be afraid if there's a little bit of fireworks here. I think if I were to talk about this book, in general terms, I would break it up into kind of three different levels. The book is obviously an attempt to, tell a story about, what we know of as the MS-13. Now, what we know of the MS-13 is very frequently what we see in the newspapers, what we hear about on the radio, what we see on the internet and social media. And very often we're entering into that picture, and I would include myself as well, especially when I first started to look at the gang, when they're already in their orange jumpsuits, they're already arrested, they already have handcuffs behind their back, and all you're hearing about is horrific crime after horrific crime. There's no contextualization at all about any of these characters, and I came at this subject from the same vantage point. The organization that I run now, Insight Crime, we very much impersonalize when we talk about crime. We talk about big criminal groups, and and it is somewhat a little bit of a yellow journalism tact at some points, and we have to sort of restrain ourselves because it's a sexy topic, and it lends itself to getting a lot of attention for sure, but for a lot of the wrong reasons. And some of the wrong reasons that you see it getting attention is exactly what we see coming out of the Trump administration and the way in which they use the MS-13 to conflate the notion of criminal gangs with undocumented migrants and with migrant communities writ large. In other words, they make them the same thing. They run them in the same sentences, in the same paragraphs, in the same speeches, and it's all meant to make you think that it's all the same thing. And the attempt to vilify them services them. It's a political football that services them. So how do we get beyond that? Is the question I would confront, and what I confront really with the sort of first layer of this book. And that's to personalize these stories. That's to talk about the human beings that are involved in these gangs. That's to talk about the families that are connected to these human beings who are involved in these gangs. Talk about where they come from. And most of my, the people that I profile come from El Salvador, but they can come from a lot of different places. They might come from El Salvador, but they're brought up in places like Los Angeles or Long Island, where they run into an equal number or even more problems than in their home country. Talk about sort of what happens to their families over a long period of time. My main character's name is Norman. He's not a character, he's a human being. He is a person who in many ways embodies the story of the gang, because his family was torn asunder by a civil war that was going on in the 1980s in El Salvador, which is where I start my story. And when we're talking about context, we need to go backwards a bit. We need to provide that historical context. And that's a good portion of what I try and do, especially in the first part of the book. And Norman's family gets torn apart by this war. His brother gets forcibly recruited. His mom tries to commit suicide. He sees a soldier get shot right in front of him when he's a young boy. And at the end of the war, his family just splits into 10 different pieces, and they all go to different places, mostly up to the United States. And the family is just torn asunder by the whole thing. And him in his desperation for family, for feeling some sense of protection, he latches onto what many of these kids latch onto, which is a feeling of a surrogate family, a feeling of protection, some kind of protective cocoon. That's when they look at the gang, that's very often what they see, is this kind of protective cocoon. And the only way we understand how they see that is by understanding their backstory. There's the story of Alex Sanchez, who's a very famous gang member and also now a person who runs an organization that does youth intervention himself, much like Sergio does. And he was a person whose family also was torn asunder. At a very young age, his parents went up to the United States, specifically Los Angeles, and he and his brother were left under the care of some of their neighbors. And for a while, his little brother even thought that the 3 girls in the home where he was being taken care of were his moms. These were 3 moms, he thought. He thought he had 3 moms. What a great thing. I had 3 moms, right? And then when they actually were reunited with their family, back up and with his parents, back up the 2 of them, both Oscar, his brother Oscar and Alex, when they were reunited in Los Angeles with the family, they didn't believe that the mom in Los Angeles was their real mom. And their relationship with her at that point, which had been, broken apart by 5 or 6 years of her being in Los Angeles and them growing up in El Salvador, was strained for the rest of their lives. It was never the same. And how could it be? That's how Alex starts to float towards the gang. There are other characters as well that I chronicle. One is a soldier in the army. For him, it's less about sort of feeling, this sort of missing family and more about feeling camaraderie, the kind of camaraderie that he felt when he was in the military. And after he leaves the military, he goes up to LA and he finds himself in another type of war. And he joins the gang, takes on the name Satan at a certain point, and becomes very good at what he does. He's the kind of guy who, because of his military experience, can do the types of things that are good for a gang. Especially a gang in a very competitive environment like it was in Los Angeles in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He knows how to do intelligence and counterintelligence. He knows how weapons work. He knows how to spy on people. He knows all of these things and he uses these things. he too eventually leaves the gang like Alex, and he goes through a different path than Alex. He goes through a church in order to leave the gang. So in a way, you could say Satan had met Jesus, and that's what happens. He gets out of the gang that way. And then finally, I would just mention one who's based in Long Island, and his name is Christian. And when you meet him, what you know about him is that ICE, the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency of the United States government, is knocking on his door. And they're knocking on his door because they believe he's a gang member. And the reason they believe he's a gang member is a long and sordid and really tragic story, but one that you guys who are in Long Island know, because you have seen, why things like this happen to people like Christian. His name is Christian. And that is that any indication or any possibility that you might be linked to this gang, types of colors that you wear, what you draw in your notebook, how you speak, any of these things could make you look like a gang member, or at least that's the way you're perceived by certain law enforcement that are operating in your area. And that's what happened to Christian. Christian was a teenager. He's not a teenager anymore, but he was a teenager going into a school where he didn't know anything. He was going into Huntington High School. And he had left his own country because of violence in his own country, lands in Huntington High School, doesn't speak the language, doesn't know where his classes are. And a teacher sees him kind of, aimlessly looking around. Where does he go? How does he get to his classroom? And assigns to him another student who can help him get to his classes. And that other student is a gang member. So inadvertently connects Christian with this other gang member, who then follows Christian around for years trying to get him to join the gang, and he never does. But authorities who are in the school at this point think that he has joined the gang. And they do something that was unconscionable years ago. They take information that they got inside the school, and then they pass it to the local police. They're actually police. Then they pass that to ICE, and then ICE goes and knocks on his door, brings him to a detention center, and deports him, even though he's not a member of the gang. So these are the types of stories that I'm telling. I want to personalize this story, and that's the first layer of the book. The second layer of the book, maybe we could describe as sort of cops and robbers. Cops and robbers, why? Because the gang itself is its own organism. It is a dynamic thing. It is something that emerges in the early 1980s in Los Angeles as very much a social group. They organize themselves around what many of you organize yourselves around, music in their case. They loved heavy metal music. I know you might find that hard to believe thinking about what the MS-13 is today, but that was the thing that they coalesced around. They loved AC/DC, Metallica, long hair, shorn jeans, all of that cheesy stuff from the 1980s. They formed a gang around that, but they were in a very competitive environment, in an urban space that's very densely populated, where social services and educational services are poor, not available to them. And they felt bullied. And they felt bullied because they're also in a space that was very competitive from a gang perspective. There were as many as 400 gangs at the time when they emerged in Los Angeles, just in the Los Angeles area alone. So they evolved. They evolved into, slowly, bit by bit, into what we know them as today, which is a much more violent organization, no question about it. But at the same time, and the reason I call it cops and robbers is because we have the cop side of that equation. And the cops also evolve, and they have a certain response that they have to the evolution of the MS-13. And the two start bouncing off one another. The cops evolve, the MS-13 evolves. The cops then evolve further, the MS-13 evolves. And what this entails is things like creation of special units, the type of police units that bang down your door and arrest everybody inside the house. Creation of gang injunctions, where what we might call racial profiling today, where you see a group that looks like a gang based on some flimsy definition of that you have of gangs, and you're able to corral them under the letter of the law and throw them into jails. You know, laws that allow you to enhance sentences because you are able to prove in a courtroom, again, very often under flimsy circumstances, that these are gang-related crimes, so you can tack on 5 or 10 years to a sentence. And what happens there? Mass incarceration. You know, the MS-13 is not the only gang, of course, that gets mass incarcerated. Latinos in general during this time period, in the 1980s, are incarcerated in giant numbers. And what happens there? They evolve again. They fall under the rubric of other criminal organizations, more sophisticated ones, and they learn and they evolve, and this bounce off continues. Then what happens there? They get released. And when they get released, the United States starts deporting them en masse. And when they deport them en masse, they deport the gang problem south, specifically to areas in Central America. They basically begin to export the problem south. Simultaneously, these programs, this model that they created in Los Angeles to deal with gangs, gets replicated all over the United States. And then that gets exported to Central America to deal with the gangs. The same model and the same back and forth begins down in Central America as well. That's the second level of the book. And then the third level of the book, I guess I would just call it imperialism. I would call it imperialism because it's about the relationship, the very unequal and abusive relationship that exists between the United States and El Salvador. El Salvador, of course, is a proxy. We can talk about a lot of countries in this way, but I talk about El Salvador because that's the sort of epicenter of gang activity right now. And what is that relationship? Well, on the side of the Salvadorans need the United States. They depend on the United States. It's where they send all their commodities to be bought and sold. So they're dependent in that regard. So think coffee and chocolate goods. Those are the types of commodities that are coming out of, or clothing, cheap clothing. Those are the types of things that are coming out of El Salvador right now that the United States is buying. The United States is also home to about 1/5 of all Salvadorans born on this planet, close to 2 million people, about the same number of Chinese in the United States as Salvadorans, if you can believe that. And they send back about 20% of the GDP in El Salvador, a massive amount of money, far surpassing any commodity sales that they have to the United States. So that, again, they're dependent on the United States. And then the United States is just abusive towards them. They're abusive in many regards, but the most important way is that they keep and maintain a system that allows them to get cheap commodities, again, going back to coffee and cacao, and also cheap labor. How do they keep cheap labor? We have an immigration system, and the immigration system criminalizes people, and they criminalize labor. So the way that our system works is that we give capital and we give investors visas to move back and forth over borders, and we criminalize labor to keep labor costs down. All of this works to create or lay the groundwork for gangs. This imperialistic system, what I would call a neo-colonial system, lays the groundwork for gangs. And that's the third level of the book. So the book is working on these various levels. It's working on this personal level, this human level. It's working on this cops and robbers level, and it's working on this imperialism level. I'll leave it there, Mario.
Thank you, Steve. And definitely will continue this a lot. You've unpacked a lot there. So thank you for that presentation. Sergio, take it from there.
All right, so buenas tardes, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Sergio Argueta. I am the Dean at Uniondale High School. In the interest of full disclosure, I'm currently at Uniondale High School, but I have clocked out for this event. The things that I'm gonna talk about are personal experiences as far as the work that I've been able to engage in, not throughout, not just in my current role, but most importantly over the last 20 years with the founding of S.T.R.O.N.G Youth Incorporated. Um, I've been fortunate enough to gain much of my experience through lived experiences. I'm highly credentialed through the formal processes, but more or less what really complements my academic achievements are the life experiences that I've lived and those that I've been able to bear witness to. We can't talk about MS-13 unless you talk about oppression. You can't talk about MS-13 unless you talk about failed US policies, US immigration policies, and so much of what Steve's already talked about. Most importantly, you can't talk about MS-13 sort of growing the way that it has in the United States of America without addressing the intrinsically racist, biased policies that marginalize people of color, poor people throughout Long Island, throughout the world, but specifically here on Long Island. All it takes is for you to just think about where we have MS-13 sets, right? And while today's focus is MS-13, I really want to, I mean, gangs in general on Long Island, right? When we're talking about street gangs, quote unquote, or, I like to refer to them as street organizations. These gangs, if you will, exist in communities that oftentimes have certain similarities, right? And what are they? Mostly, communities of color, right? Individuals with low educational opportunities, social extracurricular activities, highly policed communities, a laundry list of things that impact those communities that don't impact all of Long Island. And we know we live in the most segregated suburbs in the entire nation, among the most segregated suburbs in the entire nation, where we allow individuals to live in neighboring communities where within a mile of each other, you'll have some of the best performing schools in the entire country that are actually less than a mile away from some of the worst performing schools in the state. And those are the kinds of things that allow these sort of issues and challenges to permeate and devastate certain communities. So I can tell you from firsthand experience that MS-13 didn't make its way onto Long Island until the mid-90s. And they weren't the first gang on Long Island. We had numerous gangs on Long Island. At that time, we didn't have the national and transnational gangs that we do that we have now. And Steve's already laid out as far as why MS-13 and 18th Street became two of the world's largest gangs has everything to do with the exporting of gang life to Central American, countries by the United States of America. And so when you put all of this together, how does it play out in our streets on a regular basis? Well, when Steve talks about the kids that he's interviewed, right? That's pretty much what we've seen. We see individuals, and we at S.T.R.O.N.G, really, we're not anti-gang as much as we're anti-gang violence, as much as we are, pro-youth development. We're about engaging our kids. And it's a simple philosophy for us. Gang life is a symptom of a number of issues that a young person is facing. And many of those are systemic. Many of those are internalized challenges. Many of those are micro level issues. Many of them are macro or meso, right? So we want to address the behaviors, the opportunities. We want to expose our kids. And that really is sort of what we focus on as far as our daily work. And that's the work that's the mantra that I use as a dean of students in a high school. When a kid comes to me and he's in front of me because he cursed someone out or she got into a fight, there's a reason why these behaviors sort of, how these behaviors manifest themselves. And it's not until you get to the root causes of these issues that you truly get to the bottom of interrupting sort of gang life, right? And so for us, the journey, the typical things that I see are the individuals that I've met that are, that become hardened gang members, right, are oftentimes in line as far as what their life experiences were. And so oftentimes one of the things that I talk about is the fact that, I'll have a 14, 15-year-old kid in front of me that I have the opportunity to work with or speak to. And the minute you start peeling back, you realize how much trauma this young person has endured throughout their life, right? Many of times, as was noted, these young people don't even know who their parents are, not because their parents were neglectful, not because their parents didn't want to be there, but because of the economic situation, the violent situation. So oftentimes, it used to be back in the 70s where oftentimes it would be the father that would leave, right? And the idea was, I'm going to send remesas back so that my family could have everything I didn't have. We've gotten to a situation now where it's not just the father that leaves. Unfortunately, times it's both parents. Sometimes it's actually the woman, the mother, that has to leave the child. And what we've noticed, and there's a number of studies where we know the importance of those parenting figures in a young person's development. But one of the biggest issues that we have now is that, originally when these parents leave their children behind, oftentimes they didn't even get to say goodbye. Oftentimes it was in the middle of the night. The child didn't know. The child woke up one day and mom was gone. But it was real easy for those loving, caring, nurturing adults to kind of, take that place and parent that child. And there's a strained relationship now between a parent in the US that's calling a child and saying, hey, you remember me? I love you. And that child remembers that voice and clicks and is like, wow, esa es mi mamá, ese es mi papá, right? And the questions become, why did you leave me? And during that time, it makes it almost easier when mom and dad are sending a little bit of money back. And now the child, if you will, within that home, and as and poverty looks very different in El Salvador than it does here, right? In certain aspects, in our home country, the children kind of live a little bit better, if you will, right? They know the language. They live inside, they usually have a home, even though it could be made of mud, right? But a kid has his own space. They know the terrain. They still get to be children in some way. They kind of know the do's and don'ts. They know how to stay safe. Oftentimes, when it comes to power dynamics within a home, that child who's getting the money sent has a little bit more authority in certain aspects. Because oftentimes the money that's being sent back is sustaining the entire family. So so this child has a nice pair of sneakers, may have nice clothing, may have certain aspects. And now when they're 13, 14, 15, because the situation is so bad, they recognize they got to send this kid away because he's prime for picking, right? Or she's prime for picking. The gang members will show up to your home and tell you, listen, like if you don't have your rent, right? You got to pay rent to live here comfortably. You have to pay a tax. If you don't want to get beat up, if you want to have a nice business, whatever it is, safety costs money. And whether it's $1 a day, right? Which to us is like $1 a day. No, $1 a day is significant when a person in El Campo is only making $1.50 working the fields, right? And so these kids are being told, okay, now you get to go to America. And the kid is like, America? I don't want to go there, right? That's literally what the response is. I don't want to leave. I'm staying here with you. You're my mother. You're my father. I don't know that woman. I don't know that man. They left me. I want nothing to do with them. No, but you got to go. In America, you're going to have these opportunities and you're going to be able to go to school and you're going to make something of yourself and you're going to work and you're going to get a lot of money and then you'll be able to send for us or send things. And it's this inspiring story about how amazing life is going to be when you get to America. And then you endure one of the most challenging journeys ever, right? You don't want to do it. You don't want to go. You see and experience and hear some of the most horrific experiences. You see assaults. You see sexual assaults. You hear sexual assaults. You're afraid of what the government is going to do. You're afraid of what authorities are going to do. And you trek, you're afraid, you're nervous. I mean, the stories that my kids tell would literally make grown men cry. Hardened grown men that say they got no fear. When you hear the story and the pain of what they go through to get here, and if they finally make it, they end up in Hempstead, Roosevelt, Brentwood, Wyandanch, Westbury, Newcastle, right? Riverhead, where as a resident of those communities, as a homegrown product of those communities, I'm not demeaning them, but aren't these the most marginalized communities? What kind of opportunities exist in communities like ours? What kind of opportunities have ever existed in communities like ours? And so you drop these kids who are now needed. It wasn't the initial rupture that creates the issue. It's the reunification. Now they come and meet mom for the first time. And now this is an adolescent. I got a 5-year-old girl and an 11-year-old girl already. Mario, 11 years old, bro. My big girl is 11. And I could tell you that she just turned 11 and she woke up, she's gonna be 12 next month. And I don't know who this child is. And she lives with me, right? Same way you guys, your parents didn't know who the hell you were during your adolescence. We know how challenging it is. All of a sudden, I got this kid with hormones. I got to learn how to navigate this. Now, can you imagine never have known this child, really? The baggage, the emotional baggage you have as a parent to leave your child, that pain, that sadness, that even when I talked to my mother, I was the first US born child of my mom's, but my mom left 2 sisters. And my sisters are in their 50s and 60s. And I could tell you, first off, they get mad if I ever told you that they were in their 50s and 60s. So don't tell them if you meet them, right? But what I could tell you is I still feel and see their pain in certain moments. And these are grown women. These are grown women who had success. Now, these women that leave their children behind, the guilt, the societal pain, all that kind of stuff. And maybe when those parents came here, they met somebody else and they started new families. And so these young people are going into these new families and they don't feel a part of that nuclear family. And no, you're not going to tell me what to do. You're my stepdad. You're my stepmom. I don't even know you. And guess what? You're the one that left me. I don't want to hear from you. And these parents are attempting to overcompensate, to bridge the gap. And it's challenging for them. And they too get to a point where they say, you know what? They don't know how to deal with it. And they in turn inflict more pain and sadness on these kids. I should have just left you there. Look at who you are. Look at this and that. And oftentimes they live in some of the most horrific housing situations as possible. So in a place where they could go out and play soccer or go to the local park or just be adolescents, even though it was so challenging in their home country, guess what? Here they live in one bedroom, in one bedroom with 2 beds, right? And they can't really go much. They don't have access to a living room. They can't be in the patio. They're told, no, you can't go out. What? You've pretty much, you put me in a cage. And then I send you to a school where you're meted by metal detectors, security guards that scream at you, directives, when you in reality don't even understand the language. And there's already gangs there too. And you get bullied and you get picked on because you don't speak the language and all these issues. Let me tell you something. Gangs exist because of the adults' failures, because of societal failures. And this is the breeding ground for all gangs, not just MS-13, right? And so in a nutshell, oftentimes these kids that join these gangs for protection while they're in these schools or on their way to and from school end up joining these gangs for a sense of connection, right? Because they want to network, because they want to socialize, because it's sad being at home. And guess what? Yo, come hang out with us. Have a drink, have a smoke. Let's pull something. Oh, you want a girl? Oh, you want to meet somebody? Oh, now all of a sudden there's a social network. That aspect of how they quote unquote heal each other, protect each other. The idea that, yeah, no, okay, these gangs are out to get me. The only way I survive this is what? Being the Lone Ranger that kind of, I'm gonna walk to my own, I'm gonna hold my own against 15, 20 people that are bullying you every day. Now, I've had kids join the gang that they were being bullied by so that they can now be protected. I've had kids whose relatives were killed by a gang in El Salvador. And now the kid makes his way here and that gang is also in that school, but there's a rival gang that offers protection. So now they join that gang as a means of, you know what, I ran from them over here. Now I'm here, I'm done running. And now you have schools that are quickly, the minute we tag you as a gang member, schools that are willing to kick you out. They don't want you in the building. And the school to prison pipeline, which is all, so all these different things sort of manifest themselves quite different and challenging here. So that's how I compliment what Steve was sharing. Go ahead, Mario.
That was great. Both of you, Sergio and Steve. I have a ton of questions. We have a good chunk of people online with us. It's about 50 people who are on the session right now, so I'm sure they have questions. I did want to ask a question that maybe both of you can address. One pertains to the impact of U.S. policy in the region, because sometimes when we raise that uh, in sessions and in events and in spaces that I've been at, when I've raised that, it gets thrown back to me as if this is irrelevant. We're in 2020, we're not in 1980, 1979, 1980, 85, 89, where the violence was so acute and it was spearheaded by the US. And so in your book, Steve, you talk about the ghost of William Walker, and you really develop clearly the viciousness of the internal war, the violence that was being spearheaded by, and backed up 100% by United States policy, which in many ways it was laying the seeds down of what we see now, right? So if you can talk about that, and Sergio, you too, in terms of your experience, again, you describe your experience here, you're born here, but your family lived that. How relevant is that experience to the current context right now when we're talking about a completely different time in history? If you could address that, Steve.
Well, I mean, for me, from my vantage point, it's what starts this vicious circle. The way that the United States establishes relationships and makes giant trade-offs in these relationships so that they can service their own ends is really the through line for the way the United States deals in general with countries outside of the United States. Listen, Donald Trump is a very raw president. He's a transactional president. So his current relationship with El Salvador and other countries in Central America pretty much circles around one issue, whether or not they deal, in his mind and his administration's mind, with the question of migration adequately. If they can keep migration numbers down, then they're going to have a favorable relationship with the United States. That's a trade-off he's making, because they're inside of these countries right now, including El Salvador, there's some pretty nefarious characters who are presidents, who are doing things that are, not exactly in line with what we would think of as, establishing strong democracies or ensuring that there are human rights and those sorts of things. So those are the kind of trade-offs that you're seeing today. And those trade-offs were made back in the 1980s, but tenfold. And the trade-off was, if this government goes against what we think of as, communist, then they're going to get our support. And that support included after the government of El Salvador had, not just massacred, thousands of its own inhabitants, but it forced a huge migration and refugee crisis to the United States. And that's what kicks off the MS-13 is this refugee flood that starts, because the United States is willing to make these trade-offs. If you do, if you are fighting against communism, then, you'll get our support. And just like now, if you fight against migration, then you have our unconditional support. So United States foreign policy at that level has always kind of worked at that transactional level. Certainly there have been slight variations, under the Obama administration and under they put a lot more emphasis on fighting against corruption, which was great. But by the same token, they had the same types of pressures that they were buckling under on a domestic level as it relates to migrants and undocumented migrants. And Obama deported more undocumented migrants than any president in history. So they still had these same kinds of trade-offs. And that's really what governs United States foreign policy, is this transactional nature. And very often these transactions are related to our own domestic policies. So it could be migration, it could be drugs, you know, this whole notion of being, you know, harsh on drugs and we're fighting against drugs, that proxy war plays out in a way that's much more brutal for countries like El Salvador, or now we're in the proxy war against gangs. And that's playing out in a way that leaves many more bodies on the ground in El Salvador than it does in the United States, and much more displacement and refugees, which is where we are now. We've gone full circle. You know, we started with the refugee crisis of the 1980s during the war, created gangs in the United States, or gangs were created in these very dense, competitive urban environments. They get out of jail, they're deported back, and they form gangs back in Central America under the same brand names that they'd formed in the United States. And now they're the ones that are pushing the refugee crisis back up to the United States. We've gone full circle. So we don't learn anything from having these transactional foreign policies that we have.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, I'd like you to follow up on that, but let me just tie it into, because those policies and counterinsurgency tend to be very ugly. And there's a quote in the book that I have here that Steve wrote, and I want you to comment specifically, Sergio, how you see it in the context of Long Island, right here in the neighborhood. Steve writes, quote, it was not an anti-communist war, which in the case of El Salvador included forced disappearances, mass displacement, and widespread judicial executions. But LA's fight against the gangs had taken on the contours of a counterinsurgency effort, unquote. And that was in the context of writing what was happening and how LA was handling this in the 1990s. Talk about that in the context of here on Long Island, when we see about the criminalization and the targeting of the folks that you're working with on a daily basis. Your mute button, Sergio.
It's only been 7 months of this, Mario. I still don't know where the mute button is. So you know what's interesting, Mario, is that individuals that tell you, oh, we're in the year 2020 now, this is in 1980. These are individuals that don't understand the impact of intergenerational trauma. They don't understand the impact of how this has, future generations are impacted by what we're doing today and our experiences. And we pass this on through our DNA. We pass this on through just, evolution to the next generations, things of that nature. We can't talk about what's going on today without talking about our past, right? And so it's extremely important for us to understand that if you were to take a sentence stem and, in the 70s and 80s, it would have been, you insert the word communism. In the 90s, you insert the word, you insert the drugs. And in the 2000s, you insert terrorism. And then, and gangs, right? Between there, right? And what's the nexus there? The criminalization and targeting of particular individuals, of making everyone else the issue, as opposed to your own oppressive, or the oppressive ways by which you perpetuate this violence, by which you perpetuate inequality and inequity that only fuels this sort of revolving door as far as what we're seeing when it comes to these issues. What's so beautiful about this day and age, right? And even as I look at this screen, this young movement, right? This youth movement that's out there with 50, and listen, I'm so inspired by my students that are asking some really tough questions, whether it's in a high school or the ones in colleges and universities, whether it's an undergrad course or a grad course or a high school course. Our kids are asking some real tough questions right now. And they're not taking, pardon my language, the bullshit answers. They want more, and they believe in equity and equality to the point where they're calling everyone on their nonsense. And yeah, if you thought you were left, right? If you thought you were left, my kids are challenging me and making me starting to think that, damn, I'm much more middle of the road than I thought, right? I thought I was so radical. Huh?
You're getting soft.
Yeah, bro. And for good reason, right? Because they are saying, this is a generation that benefited from certain experiences. And now they know and they want more and they deserve more, right? So when we're talking about what's been going on in our communities over the last decade, man, listen, I mean, just, and I say decade because this was happening during Obama's time, right? Our people were being deported. Kids, kids were going to school and coming back and their parents were gone. Except now, this individual in office had to be more vile. He had to be even more over the top. He had to really traumatize these people. And if you want to talk about what was happening back then, you got to talk about what was happening now. To think that you bring your child and you are looking for some sort of respite of violence and trauma, and now they take your child from you, like pulling her from your arms, that baby crying and screaming, saying, no, mommy, no, that mother, that father trying to hold on to their child and being stripped of that. And now you can't find 545 families, man. That is international war crimes. That's what we're witnessing. Anyone who says that they would dare vote for this individual without seeing the horrific things that he's done now, right? We wouldn't have sat by and watched, people put into ovens and all these other, that's what's happening now. It's on par as far as the vile treatment of people and the degradation and lack of humanity towards these individuals. So it requires us to be mindful as far as how this is always going to impact in the way it manifests itself. The idea of the the criminal justice system is not just. And we've already, over the last year or so, we've been peeling back that. I mean, many of us for decades, right? But over the last year, we've had to come to terms with what defund police means, right? With the reason as to why we pump so much money into these paramilitary organizations that literally target certain communities for crimes that aren't even violent. The way they've been able to strip through generations opportunities, not being able to get a job, all those things, that's being inflicted right now in the immigrant community. Whether you come here legally or not, you have individuals who have been not naturalized, but they've gotten their residency papers, allowed to live here. And because of a simple mistake that they may have made, even though they've been here since they were 5, 10, 15 years old, and now they're 40-something years old, 50-something years old, being stripped of legal status and deported, leaving families, all kinds of stuff. This is what we see. And it's playing out every single day. And when you talk about going through the criminal justice process, those of us that have gone through it, right? Those of us that know what it's like to have the state versus, right? The idea that you're only as innocent as the type of attorney you could afford, right? A system where, Brian Stevens, says it all the time. We have a system where guilty people will go free and innocent people will go to prison because they can't afford representation. Best believe that being an immigrant who doesn't speak the language, who doesn't have the resources, is oftentimes labeled, charged, and prosecuted without the most basic rights. And that's what's happening as far as enforcement.
Okay, well, we have about 20 plus minutes or so, 25 minutes. Kali, I don't know if you can, we have enough time to get some good conversation going. I have a series of questions more that I could ask, but I do by no means want to dominate and hog the conversation. So if we do have any questions, Kali, what are you suggesting that people?
Yeah, so if you do have any questions, I think at this stage you can feel free to just speak up. If we get quite a few people asking questions, please do use the raise hand function so we can see you in some kind of order. But if you do have a question, yeah, I see Andrew's raising their hand, so you can go ahead and ask your question now.
So my question is mainly for Sergio. So what do you do when you find out somebody's affiliated in your high school? Because I don't know, but I live also like right next door. I'm in East Meadow, so we're like neighbors almost.
So honestly, again, if I meet a kid who has a drug abuse issue, I don't look at the kid like a drug addict, right? I look at him like a kid, and I'm here to service a kid. So whether it's in school, here in my role, or out in the community, all we address is behaviors, right? I'm a social worker by trade. That's really, that was my training ground. So I don't necessarily look at the symptom, more or less the young person that I need to support and assist. And so what it is indicative of when I do meet someone that's gang involved, there's certain messages that I already pick up on it. And I mean, I didn't disclose this and I don't know if it came out, but as a young man, I was gang involved. And from 13 to 19 years of age, growing up in Hempstead, There were certain things that I did that I'm embarrassed to even talk about nowadays. But I also know that there was nothing innately wrong with me or my family or my upbringing, but the community in which I lived required a skill set and some decision making that required, in which I decided to take negative choices, right, and decisions, right. And you know, to me, it's that sort of perspective of having lived it and having come out of it that makes me realize, man, listen, like I'm just paying back, right, to those that paved the way for me. And by that I mean my elementary school teachers who inspired me and motivated me and laid a foundation. Middle school was real rocky and high school was real rocky, but I still had educators that were there for me. Really, what ultimately saved my life was going from Hempstead to Baldwin, and how drastically different the worlds were, right? And it's like going from Uniondale to East Meadow, very different worlds. And so what does it mean that, you know, that you're not included, that you're not a part of, you know, what you're reading? And these, like, knowledge of self was critically important to me. And I picked that up in college with professors like Mario or Marty Melkonian, who I see here, who invited me to rallies and all types of events and tapped into this spirit that I had, right? And it's not until you do that piece, right? And it requires a lot of introspection, so knowledge of self, thinking about how you're gonna do better and how you're gonna service the kids you work with. So my kids, I mean, I don't treat them any differently. If anything, I hold on to them a little stronger, right? No pun intended. And those kids are the ones I know I have to surround with a bunch of other resources and contacts. So I'll reach out to the local CBOs. I'll reach out to some key teachers. I'll reach out to some of the kids that are doing better, right? I almost said good kids, but just being conscious of your language. When Steve talks about that teacher that inadvertently said, oh, here, you know, he's going to teach, you know, he's going to show you around. You got to know who you hand that kid off to, right? This is this is important cargo, if you will. And you got to make sure you put it in the right hands. So I have young people that the majority of my kids are doing the right thing and will rise to the occasion. I have a handful of kids that need a little bit more than that. They need a little bit more support. They're dealing with some real serious challenges and issues. And those are the ones that you just have to provide more for.
Yeah, again, we have about 21 minutes. I just wanted to recognize Pepa Anastasio, Benito San Pedro, Mari Malconi, and I'm sure there's other professors there. I also understand that we have another person watching, special person, also links to Hofstra. Some of you might know her. She's the state senator from New York, from my neighborhood, Jessica Ramos, who's joining us as well. Not sure if you're going to want to pop in any comments or any thoughts, given that you deal with some of these issues on a legislative level, but it's good to have you. There is one question from one of the participants, specifically for you, Sergio. It's from Joel, who asks, do the gangs view Sergio as a threat to their ranks? Does he feel threatened at all? That's a good thought, Sergio. Right? What do you think?
So gang, you know, so oftentimes, listen, the majority of gang violence is inter-gang violence or intra-gang violence, right? Meaning that they got beef with each other. You know, unfortunately, oftentimes an innocent bystander may be caught up in it, right? You know, where you're literally a stray bullet or, you know, a misidentification. I think you're in a gang. That's why, you know, we beat you up or we did something to you. That certainly happens. There is no history of service providers and intervention workers and prevention workers doing this kind of stuff and being victims of it. Internationally or even nationally in other parts of the community where things are so dire that, you know, that issues happen. But listen, I'm in my strongest 20 years old this year, you know, and I started it when I was 22. And I think that the biggest messaging for me has been the fact that we're not anti-gang, right? Our messaging is universal. If anything, it's spiritual. We're advocating on behalf of the most marginalized kids, and we're at the forefronts. We've been fighting. You know, what's interesting is that this that the anti-police movement, right? You know, as far as the defunding of police and the appropriate funding of adequate restorative services in our communities. We were saying it in 2000, like that was our mantra, and we were so right with everything. Whether it's you know, individuals that are coming back after incarceration and being afforded opportunities, and So that's always been, and we've always talked about the racist inequities in our justice system. So those things, and going out and responding to crisis, to shootings, and advocating for resources, I think have always made them know that somewhere along the lines we're sort of we're championing the cause to have a better community. And we've never, I mean, I've never been, you know, approached by individuals. If anything, I almost feel like things are a little bit more dangerous now, and it has to do with the political climate. Like, I feel like there's certain individuals that are more aggressive and overt in certain feelings. And, you know, some of that may be my own, you know, sensitivity, if you will, hypersensitivity or hypervigilance, but it's a different type of scan. I'll finish with this. What was it, Mario, because you mentioned it, and Steve, you kind of alluded to it too. This president has had like amplified MS-13 as it, and gave it a lot of notoriety. Like, and when you're a gang member, you want to be the baddest gang in the world. You want the world to know you. Like, you get off of that. And then the fact that in the same position, he did the same thing with the white Aryan gangs, right? Like what he's doing with them, with the neo-Nazi skinheads and these little white supremacist gangs. He's giving them a lot of. So what happens when you amp both of these sides up? What are they doing? What kind of violence are they going to engage in? How amplify with, and what will be the repercussions?
That's a good point. There's a couple other questions, but I wanted to follow up on what you just said, Serge, and ask Steve in particular this question, because you do focus, when you focus on the stuff that was happening in LA about the corruption, those heavy duty levels of corruption that we saw in LA, and same here in New York City and other urban areas in terms of police departments. When we talk about defund, how does this issue about addressing gangs relate to this idea of restructuring, defunding, reforming, or totally deconstructing the police department as we know it? If you could address a little of that, Steve, because it's an ongoing thing. Whenever we talk about criminality, it's always about attacking the gangs, never really addressing the criminality that may exist within even police departments are supposed to be confronting it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would just circle back to what Sergio was also saying about his own work. You know, the question was about whether or not gang members think or feel threatened. And what I found in my research is that police are more threatened by Sergio's work than the gang members themselves. And the people who work in the type of jobs that Sergio has, they get targeted because there is a strong belief inside of law enforcement that they never leave the gang. And I would bet that Sergio has experienced that as well. I'm not going to put him on the spot and ask him to talk about it, but I'm pretty sure that that's probably the case. In terms of the response, because we've always framed gangs as a law enforcement issue and not as a social issue, not as a wider social issue, the response is always crime and punishment. That's the way we look at it. We look at it through that very narrow lens. So by looking at it through that very narrow lens, then the police balloons, which is what happened back in Los Angeles. And then that became the model. And then that model was exported. Part of that model was the militarization of the police. That began in Los Angeles at the time that the MS-13 was emerging in the 1980s. They were the first ones to get tanks. They were the first ones to have military training. They had a military training academy that would check your height, check your eyesight, all of those sort of militarized ways that they looked at policing. That was exported. So it wasn't just that they were getting most of the money and most of the resources. It was also that they were militarizing their response. They thought of this as a war. They thought of this as conquering territory. So this is the model we're left with. This is the legacy of that time period. That's what's been exported. And at the expense of every other program, of the types of programs that Sergio has worked on. You know, he's fighting for funds. He's fighting for peanuts compared to what these guys are getting on that side. So the question of defund the police, maybe it's not the best framing of the question. Maybe if we reframed it of how do we widen the lens and start to fund every part of the equation that we need to fund to deal with this issue. And so it is, you know, we're not going to take, no one's going to take away the funding of the police. The police shouldn't be sweating bullets out of that. We know that. That's not going to happen. But we do need to fund much more things that we don't think of and don't relate to gangs. ESL programs, for instance. Other social services that intervene in families where there's suspicion of physical or sexual abuse. Why aren't we putting more money towards those? Because there's a commonality in a lot of these gang members, and they've been abused. So why aren't we dealing with that issue? Because it's not politically palatable. People don't take this on as an issue. And these long-term sort of impacts that these types of things can have, which really would be getting at the root causes of a lot of these things, you know, they don't get addressed, unfortunately. So if we're going to talk about defunding, well, let's talk about widening out the funding base, and widening out the funding base to deal with things that are happening inside of schools with targeted intervention programs. And they can be collective programs, so after school programs. They can be individual programs, so cognitive behavioral therapy programs. And then target the wider issues that we're dealing with, you know, ESL programs, other programs to integrate people into the communities, not have these, you know, disparate, racially broken up communities, you know, all of those things, and early family intervention. You know, those are all super important things, but they're just not politically palatable. We have to sort of make them part of the equation again.
Steve, Mario, you gotta let me jump in. So Steve, so this is one of those examples where I'm like, yeah, no, we're getting too soft, right? And that's the beauty about these young people. Like, yeah, no, you know what? I don't care that the police have to sweat, right? Like, yo, we have pumped millions and millions and millions into these departments. When you have a Nassau County PD officer who with 60 college credits is making 150, 180 G's a year and is gonna retire on the most incredible pension, yet teachers and social workers and, you know, with masters and so much tuition, right? And so many loans, they can't even survive, right? Like, yeah, no, we are really, where we put our interest, right? Where we've made our investments, where we as a society have decided we're gonna pump all these resources. You know, there's a problem when I could send a 16-year-old kid to a brand new jail, right, to the tune of $350 a day to warehouse them, but I can't give the kid an after school program, right? Or I can't give the kid the opportunity to go out and work. And there's all these things that, so you know, so I want to push back on that, right? And that, no, that's why, yo, these young people are on the money. No, defund, and we could frame it however we want. No, we want to defund. We know when there's a crisis, I need to call 911 when I need you to respond because this is an emergency or there's a murder or these are the crimes that happen. But that's what police do. These other things, running DARE, right? Running GREAT. Gang resistance through education and training. I got my first hand on a handbook when my daughter came home with it. And I'm like, this is such a joke. And the stereotypes being perpetuated without them even understanding, right? So it requires us to, yeah, now let's push back. But yeah, no, we need those resources. Where they're gonna come from, let's figure it out. But I know where we could get it from. I know that they have tanks, right? And my kids don't even have laptops. I know that they have helicopters and my kids don't even have Wi-Fi during remote learning. You understand what I'm saying? So like, yeah, nah, they need to give us the money.
We have to have a conversation. We have a few hands raised, right?
Fireworks, baby.
I think Robin Preet, I see a hand up.
Yeah, sorry. My name's Robin Dillon. I just first and foremost want to thank Mr. Argueta for sharing his personal experiences and on a professional and personal level. And then my question is, do you think political reforms coming from the current Housing and Urban Development Administration can bring about real true change in suburban communities with regards to like gang violence?
That's directed at you, Sergio.
Yeah, so HUD has never provided any opportunities, really. I mean, if anything, they perpetuate the criminalization of impoverished people, right? And the whole criminalization of this entire population. So you know, not being able to live somewhere if you've been convicted of a felony or a misdemeanor related to drugs, right? Who you can and can't associate with. Much of the policies that are, you know, that are implemented have only strengthened, you know, gang culture, if you will, because, you know, while in certain buildings you can't live a certain way and experience certain things, let's believe that on the perimeters, that's where they are, right? So we push these sort of issues or individuals involved in these illicit activities to the perimeters, right? And that still exists in those places. As far as what the Trump administration is, you know, the laws that they're saying they changed now. Listen, wherever there's a when we talk about the push-pull forces of migration, right? Wherever there's employment opportunities, you're gonna have immigrant populations. Wherever there's a need for workers, I mean, wherever, you know, wherever opportunities exist, you're gonna have to deal with us whether you want to or not. And I think that it's that you know, it's not even dog whistling anymore, Mario. It's like full blown amplifying. You know, I don't care. Those people don't belong in suburbia. You know, Long Island is a very different community now than it was 30, 40 years ago, and I don't understand how you get it back to what it was for certain individuals that missed that. So I don't even know if I answered your question, but I think that the policies coming out of the government, federal level, and even, you know, I'd love to hear the state senator jump in here as well, because some of this stuff is also, you know, also things where the state is really behind on pushing back on a lot of this as well. So
yeah, I want to go to another student question. Damali Ramirez is a student in journalism. But just a quick comment on that, Serge. We also look at local towns and villages that have very discriminatory housing policies, particularly here on Long Island, where entire buildings get cleaned out and the residents, namely Brown, Latinx, et cetera, are harassed by landlords and pushed out. And the idea is to kind of redevelop for kind of safe communities and kind of new green kind of communities. And you see that happening a lot throughout Long Island, and it's an ongoing problem.
Mario, just one thing on that. Even when they have the right policies, and in this case, I remember for part of the book project, I followed around Timothy Sinney, and on paper, you know, he's a smart guy and everything, and he lays everything on the ground. He's very liberal. He's a Democrat, and they had not signed those famous 287G agreements, which would deputize local police. So on paper, there was no relationship between ICE and the local police, but in practice, there was a very clear 287G, even though they never called it 287G. So even when they have the right policies on paper, very often in practice, that's not how it plays out.
Absolutely. So we have two questions. Damali, and I also missed another student, or I think it's a student with the hand raised. It just says iPhone, which is a strange name, but I think they also have a question. Maybe we can take both the questions and then we can summarize, because we have about 6 minutes. I would go 10 minutes, but I'm not sure if the tyranny of the clock is going to let me. So Damali, and then the other guest who has the hand up.
So as you guys mentioned before, you know, you guys mentioned that, you know, current president has amplified the platform for MS-13. So my question is, how can the media address the root causes of MS-13 violence without amplifying their platform?
That's a good question. In fact, that was related to a similar question I was going to ask. And then the other guest with your hand up, if you don't mind demuting and. Okay.
Hi, my name is Ariadne. I'm sorry about that. I'm actually using my phone for this meeting. But I just wanted to say that I graduated Valley Stream Central High School, which was a high needs high school. And I saw many people, it was a very diverse school that were gang affiliated. So this is kind of directed to Sergio. And as a Latina, I was very grateful for a program that was instilled called Aspira. It was a youth leadership development program that I attended. It allowed us to go to colleges in the city for tours. And it just brought a light to many people who I knew were going down the wrong path. And I just feel like if more programs were instilled, like, I don't know if it's instilled at Uniondale High School, but I feel like those programs are very important, not only for Latino members, but I saw for many other communities, it kind of showed that even though your family has been oppressed, you could still succeed because of programs like these. So I just wanted to ask if there are programs like that at Hofstra, or if there are programs there at Uniondale, and if there should be more amplified.
Good questions. So you both want to take those two issues as we wrap up? I think we have enough time.
So real quickly, I think Steve's research and his book is an example as far as what individuals and media can do to really change the framing and bring to light those things, the myths. You know, similar to what we were discussing earlier. I think that some of the, you know, I mean, hermano Mario, se me olvida el nombre de la hermana that was with us a year ago, 2 years ago from
oh yeah, yeah, she's from Intercept.
Intercept.
Oh.
You know, so there's
Berry,
good
Alice Berry. Yeah.
There's some phenomenal reporting being done right now that is really bringing to light, you know, these horrific conditions and situations that are happening. We were a part of a PBS documentary that was really, you know, nationwide and international, really giving different angles. So there's a number of reporters out there doing some outstanding work. Here, we have various organizations in Uniondale that are doing some phenomenal work. So CBOs, but internally, tenemos una organización. We have an organization called Latinos Unidos, and they're doing some of the same work that Aspira does. But, you know, Aspira is a program that is needed, particularly in communities where there are heavy Latino influences, right? But it's not just in Aspira, it's my African-American little brothers and sisters who also need that, right? When we talk about equity in education, when we talk about just the nonsense that we still get fed every day, as far as, you know, 1492 Columbus and all these different things that mean absolutely nothing to our people, knowledge itself is critical. And that all, you know, we know, particularly in the lives of young people of color and a specific focus on Black and brown boys, it's needed now more than ever. So kudos to you guys, and kudos for your phenomenal work in terms of what you guys are pursuing and being on the discussion. So thank you, Steve.
Steve, last thoughts on the media.
Yeah, I would just reiterate, because I know we're down to the wire here. Just reiterate some of the things that have already been said. And for me, the most important thing is telling human stories, is finding the individual and the family stories and telling the story through these vantage points. You know, we don't hear enough about all of these, you know, different people who are involved in this. All we get is a very impersonal look at this, and very often from the kind of top down. So the police's view or the politician's view. Well, let's go down to the ground level and get that view. The second thing is context. Context matters. Context, we always contextualize, and we give the benefit of the doubt to these, you know, to these crazy rampaging white men who end up, you know, shooting people. And we say, oh, they're crazy, they're lunatics. And we never put any, you know, anything, you know, context to all of these other people who are involved in these things, to understand where they come from. And then the third thing is reframing. I think the reframing, the issue of reframing these issues, you know, widening out the lens to think about, you know, the police, and that this is a, you know, for us, for me in particular, you know, the gang is a social phenomenon first, and it's a criminal phenomenon second. That's a reframing. We need to reframe this issue in those ways in order to get at the right solutions.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. And I also feel that with so much misinformation out there, the idea is to search out the good information, but even more importantly, search out yourself firsthand, get involved in the community, get engaged directly. And there's so many organizations. And so that's the mission of CCE, is to get students involved in those communities and to connect directly with those people who are dealing with these issues on a daily basis. Just a quick note, and Damali is one of the people who's involved with our community media news site, the Long Island Advocate. So we're going to be putting some of this content on the Long Island Advocate, but we're also going to get it on the radio, WRHU. The idea is to share this information far and wide. Check out Strong Youth Inc. Serge, the website you put up on the chat room for more information about Strong Youth Inc. and InsideCrime.org, Steve Dudley's organization, that also very important to keep in touch with. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and hopefully this conversation will continue, and stay strong and be safe. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot,
Sergio and
Mario.
Sergio. Abrazos para los dos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not sure. Did you want us to stay on and recap? Is there anything else you need from fellows, Mario? Oh, you're on mute.
No, I think we got it. This is great with the audio. I'm going to take it and cut it. We'll put it on WRHU and some other places online, hopefully on the CCE website and other places. So excellent. Thank you so much for your time on this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think Steve left, but thank you, Sergio.
Yeah. Serio. Cuídate.
Thank you.
Abrazos.